Welcome to the fastest daf in town. Today we're Chulin daf Yud Zayin. We are going to begin on Yud Zayin Abed Alf, about 8 lines from the top. So we learned that based on a pasuk that we saw in yesterday's daf, Ki Yirchak Hashem Lekechas Gvulcha, that there's two opinions. One is that in the time of the Mishkan, while we're in the wilderness in the Midbar, we're not allowed to eat basar taiva, which are just for our own benefit, because you could have simply brought a carbon shlum and you could have eaten the meat there. However, once we entered Eretz Yisrael, they matered basar taiva, and then after nowadays, 2026, it's still mutter, and that's what it means, l'olam shoich, that we still do shchita for basar taiva. Rabbi Kiva said that really what that should mean is it should be obvious that you should be able to eat basar taiva because there's no Beis HaMikdash anywhere, far away. So since ki yirchak mimcha makayim, so therefore of course you should be able to. But rather it has to do with the din of nechira. Nechira, as we saw yesterday, actually on top of Yud Zayin Aleph, is referring to just ripping apart, cutting or tearing open the simanim without doing shchita. Now that was something in which was aserd, and the question is, maybe just like it was allowed in the time of the Midbar, maybe it's allowed now. That's what it means, that we still have to do shchita and it asers nechira. Okay, so what is this machlokas? So Rabbi Kiva savar basar taiva lo itzer klal. So the whole other svar is, must be that we weren't allowed to have basar taiva, eventually we're allowed to have basar taiva. No, that's not what the pasuk's telling you. According to Rabbi Kiva, it has to do with nechira, because basar taiva was never asered, even apparently in the time, according to him, in the Midbar. Rabbi Shmuel savar basar nechira lo ishtri klal. He says that nechira, just tearing up an animal, was never allowed in the time of the Mishkan. So Bishlam Rabbi Shmuel, I can understand Rabbi Shmuel who says that nechira was never allowed. Shachat as ben habakar. That's why it uses the language of shchita all the way through. We don't actually ever find any language that nechira was ever allowed. El Rabbi Kiva, may v'shachat. Why does it say v'shachat, which is mashma that the only way you could kill an animal is with shchita, but not with nechira? The answer is kadshim shiny. You're right. Of course, when we're dealing with kadshim, I agree. Nechira was never allowed. You always had to do shchita in the time of the Mishkan. You had to, if you want to bring an oyla, shlomim, whatever. So of course you had to do shchita. Nechira wasn't allowed. We're talking about chulin. When it comes to chulin, name of our Masechta, that, according to Rabbi Kiva, says was allowed in the time of the Mishkan. So Pishlam Rabbi Shmuel Hanan said, the pasuk says Hatzayin Babakar Yishchat. No, Yishchat. Now that pasuk l'chayra is referring to Chulin, and yet nonetheless the pasuk is referring to the language of shchita. El Rabbi Kiva, my hatzayin v'habakar yishchad lehen, yinchar lehem eboile. Should say the language of nechira. So zel nechira sholhen zuhi shchitasa. Shchita doesn't mean literally slaughtering with a knife. It just means the proper ritual manner in which the animal is killed. So nechira was allowed. So that word can be interchangeable, according to Rabbi Kiva. Bishlam Rabbi Shmuel Hanan. So that's really, again, part of question 10 as well, as we saw in yesterday's daf, that his nechira was shchita. Bishlam Rabbi Shmuel Hanan. That's why we learn later on, Hashaichet, when it comes to the shchita, v'nis navla biyada, and it became a nevela in your hands. V'hanoicher, and then it says, let's say instead it was ripped apart, v'ma'aker, it was torn open, patum chasais. So in all those different cases, obviously we didn't see the Mishnah, but nonetheless, in all these different cases, there's no kisu hadam. Says Rashi, v'nis navla Kigayin alidei pigima sakin, became developed through the nicks on a knife, which we'll see more later on today's daf. But noicher medas, so you ripped it up intentionally. V'losh nechira shikayrel archa, you rip it in its length. Nechira bi'ad hachaza, from the nostrils until the innards, until the stomach. V'ma'akir simanim, you rip apart the simanim. And Rashi says, of course, is referring to a chaya, a wild animal that typically does require kisui adam, such as a deer or a ram. So he says these cases you don't have to do kisui adam. Why? So Rashi quotes, because the pasuk says, "Asher yoichel b'shafach v'chisa." It's something which you could eat, you cover it up. So b'roi l'chilu hakas medaber. It's only something which you could eat. B'afilu manda mechayev kisui b'shayched v'nimsas treifa. There are shitas that hold. If you did the shchita, a proper shchita, but you did the inspections, you found that there was some type of sircha, there was something wrong with the lungs. So in that situation, you still had to do kisei adam. Over here, what do we see? At least, at the very least, you have to do shchita. El Rabbi Kiva, my patum l'chasois. Why, according to Rabbi Kiva, would you say you don't have to do kisei adam? Says Rashi, al kisui hadam b'midbar netztavu. There was this obligation of doing kisei adam, not just in the nowadays, but also in the times of the midbar. Now, v'nechirasan haisa shchitasan. So if that's true, that according to Rabbi Kiva, nechira is the same thing as shchita, b'zman hazen nami neboy kisui. So why would we not say that you'd have to do kisui adam on nechira? So Gemara says hayel v'isteri itster. Since it became usher, it's usher. In other words, nowadays it's usher. So since it's usher, you don't have to do kisui adam. It's true back then when it was good. So of course you had to do kisui adam because there was nothing wrong with doing the chira, and according to Rabbi Kiva. Okay, Bishop Rabbi Kiva. Okay, now finally Rabbi Kiva's getting some support, some love. Yomer basar taiva lo itzer klal. He says you're always allowed to eat meat which were not carbon related. That's why it says in Devarim, it says ach kasher yoichel asat tzvi v'sa'ayil, just as you will eat the tzvi, the deer, and the ram, kein tachlenu, so too you should eat this. Which is apparently is referring to, and look at Rashi, ach kasher yoichel achshav. It's referring to nowadays, from the time you entered Eretz Yisrael. And Rashi says, shal achshav ein srichin le'achal b'taharas hakodesh el katzvi v'ayil shal achshav shatami v'atar yoichlenu b'karachas. They can eat all in the same plate. El Rabbi Shmuel tzvi v'ayil gufa mihavi shari. How could he have said that this was allowed? According to Rabbi Shmuel, he will agree that when did the Torah aser behemoth chazel akarava? That's only referring to an animal that's fit to be makrav. That is when there was an iser nechira. However, when it came basar taiva rather. So you're right. The whole issue of basar taiva, as we said, is linked to the karbanos. So a chaya is not brought as a carbon. So even Rabbi Shmuel would agree that when it comes to chayin, which is not shaykh, to be brought as a carbon, fine, he's maskim that there is basar taiva there. Boy Rav Yirmiyah. So now Rav Yirmiyah poses a question. Every basar nechira, when it comes to the pieces of meat that nechira was done, now again, nechira was allowed, at least according to this this opinion of Rabbi Kiva, was allowed in the time of the midbar. So let's say they did the nechira properly, and it's right before entering Eretz Yisrael. Shechnisu Yisrael imahen lo aretz mahu. According to Rabbi Kiva, again according to Rabbi Shmuel, nechira was never allowed, but according to Rabbi Kiva, was allowed. So what's the din of this meat? It was mutter, it was kosher meat, if you will, and now they're going to Eretz Yisrael where it became aser, amos. Ilema b'sheva shekivshu. If we're talking about during the 7 years in which we were conquering the land of Eretz Yisrael, so hashda davar tami ishtari lehen, they were even allowed to eat non-kosher foods. Dechsiv ubatim aleim koltuv, houses that were filled with all good. Says Rashi, save the krav yachalta v'savatin, you could eat it. The Yom Rabbi Yirmiyah Barabba Imarav Kitoli de Chaziri, right? Which sounds pretty hard to imagine, but just simple reading of this, they ate chazir, they ate bacon. They were allowed to eat non-kosher food, they were allowed to eat chazir when they entered into Eretz Yisrael. So Bas Nechir Maboy, So if they're allowed to eat pig and bacon, which again, you gotta wrap your mind around why that was allowed and what does that mean, but just taking it for its face, they were allowed to. So they were allowed to eat pork, which is the biggest no-no. Someone doesn't keep kosher, at least they're machmir not to eat pork, pig. So if they're allowed to do that, then certainly bas nechira should be allowed during those 7 years. El acher mikan. So let's say somehow you kept this meat from before, and now all of a sudden it's after the 7 years. So that's the shaila. After that, does the meat become usher to eat? The first 7 years, ki ishtril who shal v'kachavim did who l'ishtri teku. So he said maybe the only thing that we allowed is that which we conquered against our enemies. So we can understand we didn't have the ability to plant or anything, so we were engaged in war. So we ate the spoils of war, and it was probably a lot of non-kosher food because we had in brera basically. But that's like the heter. That's the logic of the heter. Anyway, to question whether or not it's allowed, or it remains allowed, or it's not allowed. Okay. So Rabbi, or maybe Rava, Shanisa hakoyel sheichten. So we learned in our Mishnah that everyone can shecht. Oyom sheichten, we always shecht. Bechol sheichten, what? So my Mishnah, what exactly is this talking about? Bechi tema ben betzur ben betzuchas ben kuram b'shul kana. Maybe it's just telling you like what instruments you can use to shecht with. You can use a knife. You can use obviously a stone, even glass, reeds. Again, if it doesn't have splinters. Hadumid the hakatani. So it's got to be comparable to it, says Rashi. Right? So I hanach b'sheichtim hainami b'sheichtim, vi hanach ben nishchatin hainami ben nishchatin. Elomarava, what exactly is this Mishnah talking about? So hakol sheichtin chadli suyikuti. One, as we went through this at the beginning of this Masechta, is coming to include that a kuti is allowed to do the shechita, but chadli Yisrael mumar, and also the Yisrael mumar is allowed to do the shechita as well. Again, we saw this on Daf Gimel. You can shecht that day and night. Of course, as we saw on Daf Yud Gimel, it's only when there's a torch. So it's like Dumidiyim. Not like a blind person, which is Dumidalayla. Ben B'Rosh Gag, Ben B'Rosh Svina. You're on a boat, you're on a roof, right? We're not concerned that something may happen. You may not do the shechita properly. Or maybe you're worshipping some type of avodah zarah. So he said, obviously it has to have a straight, sharp edge. It can't have a jaggedy thing like a sickle or a saw. So Vudu Shmuel, pagam b'shadar, pagam b'shadar. So says Rashi. So Shalchule, they sent the siman regarding all different pigimos. So the question is, what is allowed? So it says also b'sakin pigimos harbe. There was a lot of pigimos on a knife. She'enu daimazulzu, not like each other. Shadar Eretz Yisrael leida ezu asur of ezu kshera. So they brought a whole bunch of knives, and they said, well, which knives are allowed, which ones are not. So they gave all these different knives with different problems, so they'll be able to determine which ones are good. So Shalchala, they said, Kamigira Shaninu. It's anything which is like a saw, which is like a V in its shape, is a problem, says Rashi. What do you do? If you take your finger, or hopefully a very long nail, so you don't cut your fingers, you go from one side to the next to that knife. Zefarcha chaygres beoikets shosad harosh shad boyde kamarisha l'seifa zefarcha chaygres beoimets shel rosh. Basically, you go from one side to the next to be boydik this knife to be able to make sure it's not comparable to a megira like a saw. But megira shaninu. Okay. Fine. Just make sure there's no question before we turn the daf. Okay. So let's turn the daf. Tanraban. As we continue Yud Zayin Mebei. So the Gemara says like this. Sakin sheish ba pegima is harbe. Let's say you have a sakin with a whole bunch of nicks. So tidin kemigira, it's like a saw. It's possible. Can't use it. The shein ba el pegima achas, but it only has one nick, so it depends. Oigeres psula. Mesuchseches shera. So hechidami ugeres. What does this mean? Oigeres. Hechidami mesuchseches. What is a case of mesuchseches? So Amar Eliezer ugeres mishtei ruchais. It means that there's a nick. It has. If the nick has two sharp tips that take hold of the siman, so the shechita is not good even b'diavad. Mesusaches is muach achas. Only one sharp tip, but the other is smoothed out. So in that case, b'diavad it's going to be kosher if, as we're going to see, some stipulations by mesusaches. Says Rashi, Hainu she'ein lepegima el oiketz echad, which has only one sharp tip. Okay, it only has basically one sharp tip, mesuchseches. Okay, and then Rashi is going to mention this over here. Obviously, it has to be kishayach heavy. You can't bring it, but you can't check both sides because then it will tear even mesuchseches. We're just going to say it right now. So that's the difference. So Amr Eliezer geres mishtei ruchais, mesuchseches merachachas. So ma'ishna. Mishtei ruchais. So why, when we're dealing with a geres, which the nick has two sharp tips, that it's possible even b'diavad to moish rakama, because it's going to hold on to the first one's going to grab hold of it, and machlish umor shabatra baza. It's going to tear apart the meat of the second one. So meruach achas nami chorpa de sakina, due to the sharpness of the knife, machlish umor shabaza. It's going to cut into the flesh. This is the kamaration of the sakina. So what you do, it's talking about it's on the at the top of the beginning of the knife. It's not in the middle. If it was in the middle of the knife, you're right, it could be a problem. On one side of the knife is okay. Saif ki azla, even once you get to it, machasha ki asabaza. It's gonna, when you go back and forth, it's gonna tear. So kigoyin shahach v'lohevi. It has to be that you only did one direction, but not the other direction. You went the other direction, then you're right. It will, even with success is a problem. Gimel midus besakim. It's three basically different types of knives. Oigeres, when it comes to this knife, which has the nick has two sharp tips, lo yishchet v'im shachat shchitas psula, which means even b'diavad is not good. Mesuchseches lo yishchet ba'al lechatchila v'im shachat shchitas kshera. However, the successes, which only has one sharp tip, but the other is smoothed out, then it's kosher b'diavad. And again, it has to be on the side, can't be in the middle. It's got to be all the way at the end, and you can only be melech and not mevi. All of the yared b'sakin. Let's say you have a knife that is not smooth, but it's not that there's nicks, but it goes up like almost in waves. So sheichad l'chatchila, then it's okay. I heard the mesuchseches is not good. The ha'omer Rav, I guess, mesuchseches shares, so it's a stira. L'kasha kacha hach v'hevi, kacha hach v'lohevi. Again, if you go back and forth, then it's going to tear, and it's going to be possible. However, if you only go in one direction, then b'diavad it's okay. Amali Rav Acha b'reida Rav Avi Rav Ashi dami l'saso mai. Let's say it is comparable to a wheat stalk. No, it's not sharp, but it doesn't have any pegimois. So in that situation, will that be okay? So if we look at Rashi, Ovi Yared, Shenifgama pagam gadol, it's like one big pagam. The hochla ha'oiksin, it's like smoothed out. Okay, so what is the din when it comes to this like wheat stalk? It says Rashi, shibolim she'enu cholik. It's just not smooth, right? So can use that knife, but she'en pia of a pagam ein law. It does not have any pagimois, so can use that knife. So I'm man yoim mebisrei v'achlinan. Who will give me from this meat that we shall eat it, which is basically a nice way of saying it's okay. How do we have to check the knife? That you shall shecht with this. So this is referring to B'Shoyel. This is referring to the time of Shaul, the king, the first king of Klal Yisrael. And he said this. So why does he say this knife? Must be that's a specifically examined yechaltim, and only after you eat it. So pshita, kibadachi, nakav. If there's a hole, treifa, boy bedikul chacham, treifa. Says Rashi, if there's a hole, if there's a hole in the treifa in the veshet, so it's going to make it treif. So pshita, of course, you need to do a bedika. If you find a pagam in the nekev. So he says, bedika l'chacham kamrinan. Is it necessary to actually not just have the bedika being done by someone who knows what he's doing, like a sheikhet, but does he give it to show covenant l'chacham as well? And we said yes, based on this. Rabbi Yochanan so the truth is, this is just an asmachta for the pasuk. It's only din derabanan. It's not a chiyuv d'oraisa to do so, but again, the kavod shall to show kavod. That's what we do. Now, how were they boidik? In Eretz Yisrael, they use the sun. So Rashi has two interpretations. One is so you basically hold it up by the sun. You can, with good sunlight, and you can see by the sharpness, the sharp side, if there's anything wrong with it. Rashi says, the blade is up top, and this way what you do is you look, let there be a shade that hits down, and through the shade you could see if there's any pagimos. It's basically this idea of the second answer. And that's in Eretz Yisrael. But in Nardah, they use water. So Rashi also says two explanations. Either they flipped over the sharp part to the bottom, and what they do is they basically took it against the water, and it says if there was anything wrong with the knife, there would almost be like ripples in the water. You could see that there's something unique, there's something different about that part of the knife. And therefore that was one way to be boidik. Another interpretation, Rashi says, the blade was up top, but it was like at an angle, and they would put some water and they would let it go down, and that's how they would examine it, seeing how the water dripped down. Okay, that's a Nardah. Rav Sheshes was blind, by the way. He checked it with his tongue. Not advisable. Actually, I had a friend that used to do that just to kind of show off. But I cannot imagine ever even thinking about doing that. Rav Achamar Yaakov Badikla B'chut Saira. He actually used hair. He would take a hair. That's how he did it. But Surah Amri Bisra Achla Bisra Lebadka. He says if you're going to actually use basar to shecht, so then you got to examine it with basar. So you would, like, this is a very hard part of the hand. They would sometimes rub it against this part of the hand. Okay. Amra Papa Sricha B'dika Abisra. You need to be baidik with your skin, v'atufra, as well as with a fingernail, v'atlasa ruchasa. Let's just say the parentheses, as well as its three sides. So you have a knife, the sharp part, and sides. So you have to check basically all parts of the knife. Amr Amrli Ravino Rav Ashi Amr One Rav Tzama Bereda Rav Masharshi Mishmach. From your name, the Amr Lem Mishmach Rabbi said, Sricha B'dika Bisar V'Tufra V'Tlasa Ruchasa. Again, you have to check it by the flesh, the nail, and three sides. Amrli Abisra V'Tufra Amri. I understand that you should check it by the basar and by the nail. However, to check all three sides, not necessary. Actually, you do need to do it. Also checking the three sides. It wasn't said his name. So again, the reason why maybe you don't need to do it is because we said that when you do the shkita, because ravach, like it widens, so you won't even touch those sides anyway. Okay. So anyway, Yasef came to Ravashi, Aisu Sakin Kamei to Ravashi, Labodka. They gave a knife to Ravashi to examine. Or Malaylu Rav Acham Rebel Bidka, Bodka, Turfa Bisra, Vatalasaru Chaso. So again, that's how we're supposed to examine it. So Malay Yesha, yeah? That's correct. Yashakayach, you're right, very good. V'chenim Rav Kahana, that's what he also said. Rav Yemer Amar Aturfa Bisra Tzricha, not only on the nail and the flesh, here it's interesting, it says it the other way around, Talasaru Chaso Tzricha. So mi Amar Rav Zera Amar Shmuel, Liban Sakin V'Shachat Ba Shchitas Akshera. So he says, let's just get this down. A person heats up a knife and checks with it, the shchita is kosher. Why? Shechiduda kadem lavuna. Because even though we can say, well, you're not allowed to heat, maybe you're burning it, that's how you're killing. No, because the sharpness of the blade is so strong, that takes place before the heat. So Vikashlan Iva Ika Studin, maybe you're going to burn the sides. As you say, the base shkita, when you do the shkita, it opens up. So how can that be base shkita mervach ravach? For the same reason why you don't have to check all three sides. Omer Rav Huna Bar Rav Katina. Omer Rav Shimon Ben Elakah Sholosh Pegimois Hein. There's three different types of pegimois, nicks. Pegimas etzem b'Pesach. Okay, this let's get this down. Let's look at question 11 first, really quick. Sakin sheish ba pegima masuch sechas im ksher l'shchita. So the answer is, if it's pegima bereisha sakinas, like at the end of the knife, at the beginning of the knife, you can be moyach and not maybe it's a good shchitim b'diavad. But if it's not at the reisha or your melech and maybe, then it's possible. Okay, so now let's go over here. So you have three pegimas etzem b'Pesach. So what is that? What is this referring to? Look at Rashi. They're all the same measurement. So when it comes to a bone on Pesach, we know the pasuk says, "Well, sishbru etzem," you're not allowed to break a bone. So you can violate b'loy etzem lo sishbru bo. You're not allowed to break a bone. Okay, so that's a pegima by breaking the bone. Pegimas oizen b'bechor. So to make a mum on a bechor. So the measurement, you can also make a pagam on the on its ear, and pegimas mum bekachim. So in this Rashi says, v'itzrach leminkat hachlashmin and afgadaloy minchura pegima koliha. Even if you don't necessarily recognize this pegima so well, it's not so recognizable. If you hachi shirel b'chnei chitachar bar tzipayrin. Okay, it's still enough. This measurement, which we're going to see in a second. So these are the three measurements. Same thing when it comes to a knife. Why does it mention that? Because Chulin, the Chulin like Kamayri. It doesn't mention Chulin, it wants to mention things. The Chulin Pegimas and Kadei Pegimas HaMizbech. And all the Pegimos is Kadei Pegimas HaMizbech, which that the Pegam will passel as well. Okay. Bekama, this is Bekama Pegimas HaMizbech, and how much is Pegima HaMizbech? Kadei Shetacharbot Sipoirin, which is just enough to be able to find it with the movement of one's fingernail, which again is the same idea of doing the shchita to be able to determine a Pegima. So these other things, if you would rub your finger on the bone, in other words, you can see even that wouldn't be enough of a break that you violated. So too when it comes to the ear of a Bechor, as well as a mum for kachim. To meisfei, so for the Gemara, they were asked the following question: Kama begimas hamizbeach? How much is it? So Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai Omer tefach, which is a lot. Rabbi Lezer ben Yaakov Omer kazayis. So what are you talking about? So we answer the little kasha. Habatzida haba'avna. One is the tzid, and one is the even, the stone itself. Okay, let's look in Rashi. Ba'avna, when it comes to the stone itself, kol dehu, kedeksiv avanim shleimois, that it has to be whole. So all of this that we're very, very makbid is referring to the stone of the Mizbech itself. However, the tzid, the lime, the plaster, that we're not as strict, and therefore, even if there's a little bit of, it's not perfect, up to the amount of a tefach, or it says a kazayas, I'm not sure what that measurement is. Anyway, so that is the point. Okay. We're going to stop there. Let's see a couple more questions. Question 12. So, question 12? Yeah. Monolith livchais dal. Explain what are 4 things out of the 5 that the measurement pigima is kedei chagiras sipirin, that your fingernail gets stuck, right? That your fingernail gets stuck. So obviously one we know without even much hesitation is the shchita. We also know, as we saw, has to do with the pegima of the bone on carbon pesach, the pegima of an ear of a carbon of a bechor to matir it outside of Eretz Yisrael, in the Medina, but a pegima on of a blemish of kachim, pegima sakin, pegimas even hamizbech, and the stone of the mizbech. But when we talk about the tzid, that is a different amount. Okay, now let's go to TA 15. Be'elu tanoim hirshu sakim mesuchsachas. Okay, so that we had already. Obviously, a mesuchsachas in itself is a knife which only has this one nick, as we said, only one sharp tip, but it's necessary. Let's say I wrote Rakim ze al chadud v'lo yochel hoylech heavy rak b'derech echad v'lo lachzor sasakin, or by the edge, right? So not in the middle, basically, is the idea. Okay, all right. So that's that. Okay. Question TA 16. They also have that. Kalma shir pigimas hamizbeach. So that is kedei. I wrote kedei tzipoirin. Should be shetach bor. I'd like to, let's get the words right. Shetach bor. Shetach gor, excuse me. Shetach gor sipirin, right? To get your nail stuck, right? And I wrote Avulzeh Hevdel im Even ot Sid. So Even is that, and Sid is either a tefach or kazayas. And kazayas, trying to understand its size, obviously. Okay, and that's we just saw that. That's TA 16. Okay, TB 18. Kama tfachim hashulchan mekadish milmala. Okay, we'll get to that in a second. I'm not sure. Question TB 19. Kama shir pegimas hamizbeach. TB 19. Let's see, Chesman Aleph. I wrote shir shel al even al mizbeach. It should be shetach or sipirin. Shetach or sipirin. Al ha'even shel mizbeach v'tzid shel mizbeach ma'chogas im zeh tefach u'zayis. Okay, that's correct. What is this question here? Kama tfachim hashulchan mekadish milmala. This sounds like menachos over here. Ma'chogas im mekadish milmala, but ba'avir lo was that tosh masoy mechuber. V'gam yishem g'zram me'er b'yehuda b'shir im 5 or 6 tfachim. I mamish don't remember where this is. Did I skip over it? I don't know. Adkan.